Hey there, my fellow night owls. If stress has you tossing and turning, let's escape to the dusty, untamed Wild West of the 1870s, where surviving a single day was a badge of honor. Forget Hollywood's polished cowboys. Imagine trading your cozy bed for a straw mattress crawling with bed bugs, while the stench of unwashed bodies and horse manure slaps you awake. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Yet somehow folks out there turned grit into glory. So before you settle in, hit that like button and subscribe if you're up for more tales that blend history with a smirk. Only if you feel it's worth your click, of course. Now, dim the lights, grab a coffee, not the bitter frontier sludge, and maybe crack a window to let the modern world fade away. Drop a comment below with where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing our global crew unite under these starry stories. As we dive into this rugged frontier, picture yourself stepping out of a creaky cabin, the wind howling like a warning, ready to face a world where every choice could be your last. Picture this: the first rays of a 1870s Wild West dawn creep through the cracks of your rickety wooden cabin, but before your eyes even flutter open, a stench hits you like a runaway stagecoach. It's not the crisp, pine-scented breeze you'd hope for, nor the earthy aroma of adventure. No, it's a gut-punching blend of unwashed bodies, horse manure piled high outside, and what might just be raw sewage seeping from a nearby ditch. Welcome to your morning in the untamed frontier, where the air itself seems to conspire against you. You'd think your nose might adjust, but trust me, this isn't the kind of smell you get used to. It's the kind that makes your modern, air-conditioned office seem like a spa retreat. Back then, folks didn't have deodorant or daily showers. Bathing was a monthly luxury, if you were lucky, because water was rarer than a kind word in a saloon brawl. Every drop was hoarded for drinking or cooking, not for scrubbing off the grime of a hard day's labor. As you try to shake off the fog of a restless night, you shift on your so-called bed, a lumpy straw mattress that's more insect than comfort. Bedbugs, those tiny frontier vampires, have been feasting on you all night, leaving your skin a map of itchy red welts. You'd kill for a memory foam mattress or even a cheap motel cot, but here, this is high living. Most settlers considered a proper bed frame a pipe dream. Many slept on dirt floors with only a tattered blanket to fend off the chill. The bugs weren't just a nuisance, they were a fact of life, crawling through your dreams as freely as they did your sheets. You might try to swat them away, but it's a losing battle. These critters were tougher than the grisliest prospector, and they didn't pay rent. If you're picturing yourself leaping out of bed, ready to conquer the day, think again. Your body's already protesting, stiff from the uneven surface and the cold that seeps through the cabin's flimsy walls. Now let's talk about why this matters. In the Wild West, hygiene wasn't just ignored, it was practically a myth. Historical records show that settlers often went entire winters without a proper bath, their skin caked with layers of dirt and sweat. Water was so scarce in arid regions that using it to clean yourself felt like tossing gold dust into the wind. This wasn't laziness, it was survival. You needed water to keep your livestock alive or to boil your meager rations, not to chase some modern notion of cleanliness. The result? A population that smelled worse than a cattle drive in July, with diseases like dysentery thriving in the filth. If you're stressed about a looming deadline or a packed inbox, imagine waking up to this reality. No running water, no sanitation, just you and the unrelenting stink of the frontier. Yet, these folks didn't just survive. They pushed through, day after grimy day, with a resilience that puts our daily gripes to shame. But here's the kicker. This wasn't even the worst part of your morning. As you drag yourself upright, the reality of your surroundings sinks in. Your cabin, if you can call it that, is little more than a wooden box, patched together with whatever scraps you could scavenge. The wind whistles through gaps wide enough to spot a coyote eyeing your breakfast. There's no central heating, no electric blanket to chase away the dawn's bite. If it's winter, the inside of your home might be colder than a banker's heart, hovering at -20 degrees. You'd let the fire die overnight to save precious fuel, so your breath hangs in clouds as you fumble for your boots. And those boots? You'd better shake them out first, unless you fancy a scorpion sting to start your day. This was the Wild West, where every moment tested your grit, and even waking up was a small victory. So, as you sit there, scratching bug bites and choking on the morning air, take a moment to marvel at the sheer tenacity of those who called this home. Their world was brutal, but their stubborn will to endure carved a legacy we still stand on today. While the stench of the Wild West morning still lingers like a bad memory, the real test of survival begins the moment you haul yourself off that bug-infested mattress. Picture a settler named Sarah Hale, a real Wyoming homesteader in the 1870s, whose days started before the sun dared to rise. Sarah didn't just wake up. She wrestled with a world that demanded she toil, sweat, and endure from dawn to dusk. Her life, like countless others on the frontier, was a relentless grind of physical labor that would make your worst workday feel like a coffee break. No weekends, no vacations, just an endless cycle of plowing fields, hauling water, and chopping wood until her hands bled and her back bent like a weathered fence post. In the Wild West, work wasn't a job, it was survival, a bone-crushing marathon where stopping meant starving. If you're groaning about a long Zoom meeting, imagine Sarah at 30, already hunched and arthritic from years of unyielding toil. Sarah's mornings were a battle against the land itself. She'd hitch a plow to a pair of ornery mules and drag it through soil as stubborn as a saloon drunk. Plowing wasn't just work, it was war. Each furrow a hard-won victory against the prairie's iron grip. Historical records from the Wyoming State Archives note that settlers like Sarah spent 14 hours a day breaking land, their bodies battered by crude tools with no ergonomic design. A single misstep could snap a wrist or crush a foot under a plow's weight. Miners, like those in Colorado's silver camps, weren't any luckier. They'd crawl into dark, airless shafts, hacking at rock until their lungs choked on dust. Ranch hands, meanwhile, wrestled cattle heavier than their dreams, their bodies bruised from falls or kicks. Work didn't just exhaust, it broke people, leaving them aged beyond their years. Sarah's diary, preserved in historical collections, laments her aching joints, yet she toiled on because stopping wasn't an option. Now consider the toll of this relentless grind. Work on the 1870s frontier wasn't measured in hours but in survival. Farmers like Sarah faced crop failures from drought or locusts, each season a gamble with starvation. Miners risked cave-ins or poisonous gas, with no safety regulations to shield them. The average lifespan, as historians like David Winks document, hovered around 35 years, not from old age but from bodies worn out by labor. If you're stressed about a deadline, think of Sarah, who plowed through pain, knowing a failed harvest could doom her family. Yet she endured, her calloused hands a testament to a resilience that shames our modern complaints. The frontier didn't care about your feelings. It demanded you work, fight, and persist, or it would bury you without a marker. Here's the shocker. This grueling labor wasn't just physical, it reshaped the soul. Sarah Hale's letters reveal a woman who found pride in her toil, even as it broke her body. She wrote of planting wheat under a blazing sun, her muscles screaming, yet feeling a stubborn joy in defying the odds. Work was identity. It was proof you could stare down the frontier's cruelty and live to tell the tale. For every settler who collapsed, another rose, driven by a grit we can scarcely fathom. So, as you listen tonight, nursing your stresses, let Sarah's story sink in. Her world had no sick days, no HR, just the raw demand to work until the job was done. That endurance built the West, and it's a reminder that your battles, tough as they seem, are fought in a world far kinder than hers. After Sarah Hale wrestled her body through another grueling day of plowing, the Wild West threw another punch. The weather, a merciless tyrant that could freeze your bones or bake you alive without warning. Imagine John Wesley Powell, the one-armed explorer who mapped the frontier's rivers in the 1870s, waking in his Wyoming camp to a cabin so cold his breath turned to frost on the walls. The frontier didn't offer central heating or insulated jackets, just flimsy wooden shacks that mocked the idea of comfort. Winter mornings could plunge to minus 20 degrees inside, as Powell noted in his journals, forcing settlers to huddle near dying embers to save scarce firewood. If you're stressed about a chilly office, picture Powell, shivering in a threadbare coat, his fingers too numb to grip a pen. The weather didn't just inconvenience, it killed, with blizzards burying entire families in their homes, as happened in the Great Plains storms of 1873. Summer was no kinder, turning the frontier into a furnace that roasted ambition to a crisp. Powell's expeditions through Utah's deserts faced heat so fierce it melted candle wax in his pack, leaving him drenched in sweat through every stitch of his heavy cotton clothes. Historical accounts from the National Weather Service's early records show temperatures soaring past 100 degrees, with no shade or air conditioning to offer relief. Settlers like Powell endured, their skin blistered, their throats parched, because pausing meant defeat. The weather shaped every decision: when to plant, when to travel, when to pray. A sudden drought could wither crops, as it did in Nebraska in 1874, leaving thousands starving. Flash floods, like those Powell navigated on the Colorado River, could sweep away wagons and dreams in minutes. The frontier's skies were as unpredictable as a saloon gambler, and just as unforgiving. Yet the weather's cruelty forged a peculiar kind of grit. Powell endured, mapping uncharted lands despite losing an arm in the Civil War, his journals brimming with defiance against nature's wrath. Settlers endured, rebuilding after tornadoes tore through Kansas homesteads, as documented in county records from 1878. They didn't just survive, they adapted, learning to read cloud patterns or brace for storms with sod walls that barely held. If your daily stress feels like a storm, consider Powell, who faced real tempests with nothing but a battered tent and sheer will. The frontier demanded you endure, no matter how fiercely the wind howled or the sun scorched. Historical data from the Homestead Act era shows that nearly half of the settlers abandoned their claims, unable to withstand nature's relentless assault. Those who stayed, like Powell, became legends, their endurance a middle finger to the elements. Here's the jaw-dropper. The weather wasn't just a backdrop. It was a killer more deadly than any outlaw. In 1871, a single blizzard in Montana buried over 200 settlers, their cabins no match for snowdrifts taller than a man, as reported in territorial newspapers. No weather forecasts existed. You couldn't check an app to brace for a storm. Powell's team endured, but many didn't, their graves unmarked along forgotten trails. So, as you listen tonight, curled up in your climate-controlled home, let the frontier's brutal weather remind you of your resilience. The deadlines and pressures you face are real, but they pale against a world where a clear sky could turn deadly by noon. Powell and his peers didn't just endure, they carved a nation from a landscape that seemed hell-bent on stopping them. Their story, raw and unfiltered, whispers a truth. You're tougher than you think, even when the storms of life hit hard. As the frontier's brutal weather battered John Wesley Powell's camp, another daily ordeal loomed over settlers like a vulture circling a dying mule: hunger. Meet Elizabeth Bacon Custer, wife of the infamous George Custer, who chronicled her life in Montana's frontier forts during the 1870s. Each morning, Elizabeth faced a breakfast that could make your stomach groan louder than a corporate deadline. No avocado toast or drive-through lattes here, just a monotonous trio of beans, hard biscuits, and coffee so bitter it might as well have been brewed from regret. Her memoirs, published in 1885, describe scraping together meals from meager supplies, where fresh fruit was as rare as a polite outlaw. If you're stressed about a skipped lunch break, imagine Elizabeth, stirring a pot of beans over a smoky fire, knowing this was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. In the Wild West, food didn't just sustain, it taunted, a daily reminder of scarcity in a land that promised plenty. The frontier diet was a grim affair, as barren as the plains in a drought. Beans, often rancid from poor storage, were boiled until they surrendered what little flavor they had. Biscuits, dubbed hardtack by soldiers, could break a tooth before you broke their crust. Coffee, far from the artisanal blends you sip, was a gritty sludge, sometimes spiked with eggshells or salt to tame its bite, as Elizabeth noted in her writings. Historical records from the Montana Historical Society reveal that settlers relied on these staples because fresh produce was a seasonal mirage. Vegetables like carrots or greens appeared briefly in summer, if at all, and winter meant months without a hint of green. Scurvy, a disease that turned gums bloody and teeth loose from vitamin C deficiency, haunted many, as documented in medical logs from Fort Benton in 1874. Elizabeth endured, but her letters confess the despair of craving variety while staring at another plate of beans. This lack of nutrition wasn't just a culinary bore, it was a slow poison. Endure a winter without fruit, and your body begins to betray you. Joints ached, wounds wouldn't heal. Endure a year of salted pork and cornmeal, and you risked malnutrition, even if your belly felt full. The absence of refrigeration, as historians like Patricia Limerick note, forced settlers to preserve meat with salt or smoke, stripping it of nutrients and flavor. Elizabeth's accounts mention meat so tough it fought back, often spoiled despite preservation efforts. If your daily stress includes a bad takeout order, picture Elizabeth chewing through leathery bacon, hoping it wouldn't spark dysentery. The frontier didn't just challenge your palate, it gambled with your health, where a single bad meal could land you in a pine box. Here's the gut punch. This relentless monotony shaped more than diets. It forged character. Elizabeth endured, not just cooking, but rationing supplies for an entire fort, her ingenuity a quiet rebellion against scarcity. She wrote of grinding corn by hand when supplies ran low, each meal a small triumph over the frontier's stinginess. Settlers like her didn't just eat, they survived, turning meager scraps into sustenance through sheer will. So, as you listen tonight, wrestling with your pressures, let Elizabeth's story hit home. Your fridge is stocked, your coffee's warm, and scurvy's a distant memory. The Wild West's food was a test of endurance, one that makes your toughest day seem like a picnic. Those who sat at tables like Elizabeth's, staring down another bowl of beans, didn't just survive. They laid the groundwork for the abundance we take for granted, their stubborn persistence a lesson in grit under pressure. Beyond the dreary monotony of Elizabeth Custer's bean-heavy breakfasts, the Wild West served up a nastier challenge, a landscape that seemed to plot your demise at every turn. Consider Kit Carson, the famed frontiersman of the 1870s, whose treks across New Mexico's deserts were a dance with danger. Before stepping out of his tent each morning, Carson shook his boots with the care of a man defusing a bomb, knowing a rattlesnake or scorpion might have curled up inside overnight. If your morning commute feels like a gauntlet, imagine Carson, squinting into the horizon, where a clear sky could morph into a deadly tempest faster than you can say, deadline. The frontier wasn't just a place, it was a predator, with venomous critters and rogue storms waiting to strike. In the Wild West, nature didn't just test you, it hunted you, ready to make your last step a fatal one. Carson's journals, preserved in the New Mexico State Records Center, reveal a world where survival hinged on vigilance. Snakes slithered into boots for warmth, scorpions skulked in bedding, and both could kill with a single sting or bite. Historical accounts from the 1870s estimate that venomous creatures claimed hundreds of lives annually, especially in remote areas far from any doctor, if you could call those frontier quacks doctors. But animals were only half the threat. The weather, as capricious as a card sharp, could turn a sunny afternoon into a nightmare. Carson's expeditions faced flash floods that turned dry gullies into raging torrents, sweeping away men and mules alike. In 1873, a single flood in Arizona drowned dozens of settlers, as reported in territorial gazettes. If you're stressed about a rainy commute, picture Carson, soaked to the bone, knowing a misstep could mean drowning in a river that didn't exist an hour ago. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a way of life. Survive a snake bite, and you still had to face tornadoes that tore through the Kansas plains like a vengeful spirit, as documented in weather logs from 1878. Survive a flood, and a blizzard might bury you alive, like the 1871 Montana storm that left 200 settlers frozen in their cabins, according to newspaper archives. The frontier had no weather apps, no warnings, just a sky that lied with a smile. Carson survived, his instincts honed by years of dodging nature's traps, but many didn't. The lack of forecasting meant you gambled with every journey, every chore. A farmer might head to his field under clear skies, only to be caught in a dust storm so thick it choked the breath from his lungs. Nature didn't just challenge, it dictated, forcing settlers to live by its whims or pay the ultimate price. Here's the shocker. In the Wild West, nature killed more people than outlaws or gunfights ever did. Historical data from the U.S. Geological Survey notes that extreme weather, blizzards, floods, droughts, accounted for thousands of deaths annually, dwarfing the romanticized shootouts of Hollywood lore. Carson's survival was a testament to his cunning, but even he couldn't outsmart every storm. His journals recount nights spent shivering under a tarp, praying the wind wouldn't turn to snow. So, as you listen tonight, frazzled by the chaos of modern life, let Carson's tale ground you. Your deadlines and traffic jams are real, but they're not a rattlesnake in your boot or a blizzard sealing your fate. The settlers who survived nature's wrath didn't just endure, they carved out a life in a world that seemed to want them dead. Their grit, born from dodging scorpions and outlasting storms, whispers a lesson. No matter how tough your day, you're built to survive, just like they were. While Kit Carson dodged rattlesnakes and rogue storms with a frontiersman's grit, a quieter but deadlier foe stalked every settler in the Wild West, the desperate scarcity of clean water. Enter Mary Ann Bickerdike, a Civil War nurse turned Kansas homesteader in the 1870s, whose daily battle wasn't just against bullets, but against the parched reality of a land stingier than a saloon barkeep. Each morning, Mary hauled heavy buckets from a muddy creek, her arms aching under the weight, knowing the water she lugged might sicken her family before it quenched their thirst. If you're stressed about a long line at the coffee shop, imagine Mary, trudging a mile through dust to fetch water that looked more like soup than salvation. In the Wild West, water wasn't just scarce, it was a gamble, a precious elixir that could nourish or kill with equal ease. Mary's struggle was not unique, it was the frontier's grim norm. Historical records from the Kansas Historical Society show that settlers often shared water sources with livestock, bathing, and washing dishes in the same murky streams. The result? Diseases like dysentery and typhoid spread like wildfire, claiming lives faster than a gunslinger's bullet. In 1872, a cholera outbreak in Dodge City, documented in local archives, killed dozens in weeks, largely because contaminated water was the only option. Mary, with her nurse's instincts, boiled her water when she could, but fuel was as scarce as good intentions, and many settlers didn't know better. You'd think a sip of water would be a simple relief, but in the Wild West, it was a roll of the dice. If you're grumbling about a lukewarm tap, picture Mary, straining silt through a rag, hoping it was enough to keep her children alive. The scarcity didn't just threaten health, it shaped every facet of life. Struggle to fetch water and you'd spend hours each day hauling buckets from distant wells or rivers, as Mary's journals describe. Struggle to keep it clean and you'd still face illness, with no doctor to help in remote homesteads. Struggle to ration it and you'd prioritize drinking over bathing, leaving hygiene a distant dream. The arid plains of Kansas, as noted by historian Joanna Stratton, offered little groundwater, forcing settlers to rely on unpredictable rains. When roofs leaked, as they often did in sod houses, families like Mary's placed buckets to catch drips, a bittersweet harvest of questionable water. If your daily stress includes a broken dishwasher, consider Mary, whose every drop was a hard-won victory, often tainted by the land's unforgiving dust. Here's the gut-wrenching truth. Waterborne diseases were a leading killer in the Wild West, outpacing even the most notorious outlaws. The U.S. Army's medical reports from the 1870s estimate that dysentery alone killed thousands annually, with children especially vulnerable. Mary Bickerdike, known as Mother Bickerdike for her nursing, saved countless lives by teaching settlers to boil water, but even her efforts couldn't outrun the frontier's filth. Her letters recount burying neighbors who drank from a tainted creek, their bodies ravaged by fever in days. So, as you listen tonight, frazzled by the weight of modern life, let Mary's story sink in. Your tap flows with clean water, your fridge holds bottles chilled to perfection, luxuries she could only dream of. The settlers who struggled for every sip didn't just survive. They built a world where water is no longer a death sentence. Their fight, waged with buckets and stubborn hope, whispers a truth. Your battles, however heavy, are fought in a world far kinder than theirs. If Mary Ann Bickerdike's battle for clean water was a quiet war against the frontier's stinginess, stepping into a Wild West town was like wading through a cesspool of chaos. Picture Calamity Jane, the rough-and-tumble frontierswoman of the 1870s, striding through Deadwood's main street, her boots sinking into a stew of mud, horse manure, and garbage that could make your office's dirty break room look like a sterile lab. Jane, known for her sharp shooting and sharper tongue, didn't flinch at much, but even she griped about the stench in her letters, preserved in South Dakota's historical archives. The towns of the Wild West weren't quaint sets from a John Wayne flick. They were filthy, haphazard sprawls where sanitation was as foreign as a three-piece suit. If you're stressed about a cluttered desk, imagine Jane, dodging piles of waste while swatting flies that buzzed like corporate emails on a Monday morning. In these towns, filth didn't just offend, it killed, breeding diseases that turned bustling streets into graveyards. Deadwood, like many frontier towns, grew faster than a prairie fire, with no time or will for proper planning. Buildings sprouted wherever someone planted a stake, leaving streets as dirt tracks that churned into mud pits during rain or dust clouds in drought. Historical records from the 1870s, documented by historian Ann Butler, describes streets knee-deep in manure from horses, the primary mode of transport, with no sanitation crews to clean up. Flies swarmed, spreading disease from waste to food faster than gossip in a saloon. Jane, who nursed smallpox victims in Deadwood's 1878 outbreak, saw firsthand how cholera and typhoid thrived in this muck. The lack of sewage systems, as noted in territorial health reports, meant human waste often mingled with drinking water, a recipe for disaster. If you're grumbling about a long commute, picture wading through a street where every step risks a typhoid infection, your only defense a handkerchief pressed to your nose. This wasn't just a dirty inconvenience, it was a death trap. Sicken from a sip of tainted water, and you'd be bedridden with fever, as thousands were during Deadwood's cholera epidemic of 1876, recorded in local newspapers. Sicken from eating food touched by flies, and dysentery could claim you in days. Sicken from the air itself, thick with dust and decay, and your lungs might never recover. The absence of germ theory, as historian David McCulloch points out, left settlers clueless about why their towns were petri dishes for disease. Jane, tough as nails, tended to the sick, hauling water and scrubbing linens. But even her efforts couldn't stop outbreaks that wiped out half a town in weeks. Your modern stresses, tight deadlines, endless meetings, pale when you consider a world where a walk to the general store could be your last, thanks to a puddle teeming with invisible killers. Here's the shocker. Disease, not gunfights, was the true outlaw of the Wild West, claiming more lives than any bandit's bullet. The U.S. Army's medical logs from the 1870s estimate that cholera and typhoid killed tens of thousands annually, dwarfing the tally of shootouts romanticized by Hollywood. Jane's Deadwood saw entire families perish in weeks, their graves dug in haste outside town limits. Yet, she persisted, nursing the sick with a grit that shamed the chaos around her. So, as you listen tonight, weighed down by the pressures of your day, let Calamity Jane's story hit home. Your world has flush toilets, clean streets, and vaccines, luxuries she couldn't imagine. The settlers who sickened and survived in those filthy towns didn't just endure. They built communities from the muck, their stubborn will a foundation for the comforts we take for granted. Their fight, waged against a tide of filth and fever, whispers a truth. Your battles, messy as they seem, are fought in a world far cleaner and kinder than theirs. While Calamity Jane navigated Deadwood's filthy streets, sidestepping manure and disease like a seasoned tightrope walker, another peril pulsed at the heart of every Wild West town. The saloon, a magnet for trouble as irresistible as a siren's call. Meet Bat Masterson, a lawman turned gambler who frequented Dodge City's saloons in the 1870s, his sharp eyes scanning rooms where whiskey flowed and tempers flared. Far from the polished piano bars of Hollywood westerns, these saloons were crude shacks with plank counters, serving liquor so raw it could strip paint or blind you if you were unlucky. Masterson's accounts, preserved in Kansas historical records, paint a scene of raucous chaos, men shouting over cards, fists flying over spilled drinks, and knives flashing over petty slights. If you're stressed about a heated boardroom argument, picture Bat dodging a hurled bottle in a room where every night was a gamble with fate. In the Wild West, saloons didn't just serve drinks, they brewed violence, as unpredictable as a summer storm. These dens weren't about glamour, they were about survival, or the lack thereof. The liquor, often spiked with tobacco juice or turpentine for an extra kick, was a far cry from your artisanal IPA. Historical logs from Dodge City's Long Branch Saloon in 1876 describe whiskey that was little more than moonshine, sometimes laced with gunpowder to impress gullible greenhorns. One bad batch could burn your throat or your eyesight, as Masterson witnessed when a cowboy went blind after a single glass. Fights broke out over nothing, a bumped shoulder, a cheating accusation, a wrong look. Unlike the choreographed shootouts of movie lore, violence here was messy, impulsive, and fueled by alcohol. Bat, who once disarmed a drunken brawler with a swift cane to the head, noted that most saloon fights ended in stabbings or shootings, not high-noon duels. If you're fuming about a coworker's snide email, imagine facing a drunk with a knife, no security guard in sight. The saloon's danger wasn't just in the drinks or the brawls. It was a crucible for a heavily armed society. Risk a night out, and you'd rub shoulders with men carrying revolvers as casually as you carry a phone. Risk an argument, and it could escalate to gunfire in seconds, as Masterson's brushes with death attest. risk staying sober, and you'd still be caught in the crossfire of someone else's bad day. The absence of law enforcement, as historian Robert Dykstra notes, meant sheriffs like Masterson often arrived too late to stop the chaos. In 1878, Dodge City recorded over 30 saloon-related deaths, from stabbings to stray bullets, dwarfing the rare gunfights of legend. Saloons were the town's heartbeat, but they pumped trouble, drawing miners, cowboys, and drifters into a volatile mix where a single spark could ignite a bloodbath. Here's the shocker. These saloons were deadlier than the Wild West's most infamous outlaws. Territorial records from the 1870s show that alcohol-fueled violence killed more people than stagecoach robberies or bank heists combined. Masterson, who straddled the line between lawman and troublemaker, survived countless nights in these tinderboxes, his quick wits saving him where others fell. His stories recount men shot over card games, their bodies dragged out before the next round was dealt. So, as you listen tonight, worn out by the grind of modern life, let Bat Masterson's world put your stresses in perspective. Your worst day doesn't involve dodging bullets in a smoky saloon or sipping whiskey that could double as poison. The men and women who risked these dens didn't just survive, they carved out moments of camaraderie amid the chaos, their resilience a defiant toast to life's dangers. Their tale, raw and unfiltered, whispers a truth. Your battles, heated as they feel, unfold in a world far safer than theirs. As Bat Masterson sidestepped flying bottles and drunken brawls in Dodge City's saloons, a deeper chaos simmered beneath the Wild West's rowdy surface, a justice system as shaky as a prospector's shack in a windstorm. Enter Wyatt Earp, the iconic lawman of Tombstone, Arizona, whose tenure in the 1870s showed just how thin the line was between order and anarchy. Earp, with his steely gaze and quick draw, patrolled a town where law was more suggestion than rule, and a single sheriff like him might oversee thousands of square miles. If you're stressed about a parking ticket or a slow bureaucracy, picture Earp facing a mob of armed drunks with nothing but a badge and a prayer. In the Wild West, justice wasn't served in a courtroom. It was a gamble, often settled with a rope or a bullet before anyone could ask for a lawyer. Tombstone streets, as Earp's accounts in the Arizona Historical Society reveal, were a patchwork of lawlessness. Sheriffs like him were elected, not trained, and their authority stretched only as far as their reputation, or their gun, could carry. Historical records from 1879 show that a single sheriff might cover an area larger than some eastern states, making regular patrols impossible. Earp relied on deputizing locals, often roughnecks barely better than the outlaws they chased. Justice wasn't a system, it was a brawl. Steal a horse, and you might face a lynch mob before sunset, no trial needed. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, sparked by the Clanton gang's refusal to surrender their weapons, wasn't a heroic showdown but a chaotic skirmish over a town ordinance. If you're annoyed by red tape, imagine a world where law meant a noose in a crowd, no questions asked. This wasn't just disorganized, it was deadly. Fight for justice, and you'd risk your life, as Earp did when he faced down armed gangs with only a handful of allies. Fight for fairness, and you'd find vigilante groups doling out punishment based on rumors or grudges. Fight for order, and you'd still lose to a system that favored the bold over the just. Historical data from the National Archives notes that in 1878, vigilante hangings in Arizona outnumbered legal executions 10-1. Towns like Tombstone enforced strict gun laws. Yes, gun control was real in the Wild West, to curb violence, but enforcement was spotty. Earp's brother Virgil was ambushed and crippled for upholding these laws, a stark reminder that wearing a badge was as dangerous as robbing a stagecoach. Your modern stresses, office politics, legal disputes, pale against a world where justice was a loaded revolver and a quick temper. Here's the shocker. The Wild West's lawlessness killed more quietly than its saloon brawls, with mob justice claiming lives faster than any outlaw's gun. Territorial reports from the 1870s estimate that lynchings and vigilante actions accounted for hundreds of deaths annually, often targeting the innocent or scapegoats. Earp himself walked a fine line, moving between lawman and gambler, his survival hinging on wits as much as weapons. His accounts describe nights spent breaking up fights, only to face the same men's wrath the next day. So, as you listen tonight, drained by the weight of your daily grind, let Wyatt Earp's story ground you. Your world has courts, laws, and due process, luxuries he could only dream of. The men and women who fought for justice in those lawless towns didn't just survive. They laid the groundwork for the systems we rely on today. Their struggle, waged against a tide of chaos and vengeance, whispers a truth. Your battles, frustrating as they seem, unfold in a world far fairer than theirs. While Wyatt Earp wrestled with Tombstone's lawless mobs, risking a bullet for order, a grimmer shadow loomed over the Wild West, a medical system so crude it made a barroom brawl look civilized. Meet Doc Holliday, the consumptive dentist-turned-gambler who roamed the frontier in the 1870s, not just dodging bullets but battling a cough that no doctor could cure. When illness struck in a dusty town like Tombstone, folks turned to doctors like Holliday, whose training was often a few months of book reading or a shaky apprenticeship, if that. If you're stressed about a missed doctor's appointment, picture Holliday, a man with a dental diploma but no clue about germs, sawing through a patient's leg with a whiskey-soaked blade. In the Wild West, medicine wasn't a science. It was a roll of the dice, where a simple cut could send you to the grave faster than a gunslinger's trigger. Holliday's ailments, detailed in letters preserved at the Arizona Historical Society, paint a bleak picture of frontier healthcare. Tuberculosis racked his lungs, yet the cures he encountered, bloodletting, mercury pills, or arsenic concoctions, were as likely to kill as to heal. Doctors in the 1870s, as historian David McCulloch notes, operated without knowledge of germ theory, wielding tools that were rarely cleaned. A broken arm might mean amputation, performed without anesthesia beyond a slug of moonshine. Historical medical logs from Denver in 1876 describe surgeries done on kitchen tables, with infection rates so high that a minor wound often led to gangrene. Holliday, who occasionally pulled teeth between poker games, saw patients die from infections that modern antibiotics would swat away like flies. If you're grumbling about a long wait at urgent care, imagine trusting your life to a surgeon whose last patient didn't make it through the night. The danger wasn't just incompetence, it was systemic. Bleed from a cut, and a doctor might slice you open to balance your humors, weakening you further. Bleed from a fever, and you'd get a dose of laudanum, an opium tincture that dulled pain but hooked you for life. Bleed from a gunshot, and you'd pray the doctor's saw was sharp enough to make it quick. The lack of sterilization, as documented in medical journals of the era, meant every procedure was a gamble with sepsis. In 1878, a Tombstone hospital reported that half its patients died post-surgery, not from their injuries but from infections introduced by unwashed hands or rusty tools. Holliday himself, coughing blood, knew the odds were stacked against him, yet he persisted, treating others when he could, his own life a defiance of the frontier's medical misery. Here's the shocker. In the Wild West, a visit to the doctor was often more dangerous than the ailment itself. The American Medical Association's early records from the 1870s estimate that malpractice, though no one called it that, killed thousands annually, outpacing even cholera in some towns. Holliday's patients, like those across the frontier, faced treatments that could poison or maim, from mercury-laced tonics to surgeries performed in filth. Yet he endured, patching up cowboys and miners with a grim resolve, his health crumbling. So, as you listen tonight, worn thin by the pressures of your day, let Doc Holliday's story hit home. Your world has sterile hospitals, trained surgeons, and painkillers that don't double as poison, luxuries he could only dream of. The settlers who bled and survived under these quacks didn't just endure. They carved out lives in a world where medicine was as much foe as friend. Their struggle, waged against saws and sepsis, whispers a truth. Your battles, painful as they seem, unfold in a world far kinder than theirs. If Doc Holliday's shaky medical practices turned a simple cut into a death sentence, the Wild West reserved its cruelest gamble for women facing childbirth, where every labor was a dance with the reaper. Meet Annie Talent, a schoolteacher and homesteader in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory during the 1870s, whose memoirs capture the terror and tenacity of frontier motherhood. When Annie went into labor in her sod-roofed cabin, she didn't have a sterile hospital or a trained obstetrician, just a neighbor with a few folk remedies and a prayer. If you're stressed about a looming deadline or a packed schedule, imagine Annie, gripping the edge of a creaky bed frame, knowing that 1 in every 100 births ended in a grave for mother or child. In the Wild West, childbirth wasn't a miracle, it was a battlefield, where survival was a stroke of luck wrapped in courage. Annie's experience, recorded in her 1899 book The Black Hills, reflects a frontier where medical care for childbirth was as scarce as a raindrop in the desert. Women gave birth at home, often attended by midwives with no formal training or, like Annie, by female neighbors who'd seen a birth or two. Historical records from the Dakota Territory archives show that maternal mortality hovered around 1 in 100 in the 1870s, a rate 100 times higher than today's developed world. Without prenatal care, complications like breech births or hemorrhages were death sentences. Annie's labor, described in her memoirs, lasted days, with only willow bark tea to dull the pain, a far cry from epidurals. If you're grumbling about a long wait at the pharmacy, picture Annie, enduring hours of agony with nothing but a damp cloth and a friend's trembling hands to guide her through. The peril wasn't just physical, it was relentless. Fear gripped every pregnancy, as women knew each birth could be their last. Fear shadowed every labor, with no way to predict complications until they struck. Fear lingered in the aftermath, as infections like puerperal fever, spread by unsterile hands, claimed mothers days after delivery. Medical journals from the 1870s, cited by historian Linda Peavy, note that such infections killed thousands annually, especially in remote areas where doctors were a week's ride away. Annie, who survived her ordeal, wrote of neighbors who weren't so lucky, their newborns left motherless in cabins too small to hold such grief. Many men, as territorial diaries reveal, raised children alone after losing wives to childbirth, their lives reshaped by a loss we can barely fathom. Your modern stresses, bills, meetings, traffic, fade when you consider a world where giving life meant risking your own. Here's the shocker. Childbirth was so deadly in the Wild West that it rivaled epidemics like cholera in its toll. The U.S. Census Bureau's 1870 data estimates that maternal mortality claimed over 10,000 women annually, a staggering figure for a sparse population. Annie Talent, who taught school between pregnancies, saw entire communities mourn mothers lost to labor, their graves dotting the prairie like silent warnings. Yet, she persisted, raising her children and teaching others, her strength a quiet rebellion against the frontier's brutality. Her story, etched in her memoirs, speaks of women who faced fear head-on, birthing not just babies, but hope in a land that offered little. So, as you listen tonight, worn down by the weight of your day, let Annie's tale sink in. Your world has hospitals, monitors, and doctors who know more than folk remedies, luxuries she could only dream of. The women who feared and survived childbirth in those harsh days didn't just endure, they wove the fabric of a nation with their courage. Their struggle, waged against pain and peril, whispers a truth. Your battles, heavy as they feel, unfold in a world far safer and kinder than theirs. As Annie Talent braved the perils of childbirth in her Dakota cabin, clinging to hope amidst the shadow of death, the Wild West's medical woes extended beyond crude surgeries and risky labors to a more insidious threat. The medicines themselves, often more poison than cure. Meet Lydia Pinkham, a frontier-era patent medicine peddler whose vegetable compound became a household name in the 1870s, promising relief from every ailment under the sun. Lydia, operating out of Massachusetts but with her tonics sold across Kansas saloons and general stores, offered hope in a bottle to settlers desperate for relief. If you're stressed about a prescription delay or a side effect warning, imagine a settler like Sarah, one of Lydia's customers, swallowing a syrup laced with opium or alcohol, sold as a cure for everything from fever to heartbreak. In the Wild West, medicine didn't just fail, it betrayed, turning hope into a dangerous delusion. Lydia's tonics, as her advertisements in the Kansas Farmer of 1876 boasted, claimed to soothe pain, cure coughs, and even strengthen the female system. But the truth, buried in medical records of the era, was far grimmer. Her vegetable compound, like many patent medicines, was a cocktail of alcohol and herbs, sometimes spiked with toxic mercury or arsenic. Historical analyses by the American Medical Association in the 1870s reveal that such cure-alls often contained up to 40% alcohol, offering a buzz more than a remedy. Settlers, unaware of the risks, guzzled these tonics hoping to heal a wound or calm a fever. Instead, they risked addiction or worse. Mercury poisoning could cause tremors, madness, or death. Lydia's customers, as documented in Colorado pharmacy logs, often returned for more, hooked on the opium or alcohol in her brews. If you're annoyed about a pricey copay, picture Sarah spending her last dime on a bottle that might just kill her faster than her illness. The betrayal wasn't just in the ingredients, it was in the system that peddled them. Trust a traveling doctor hawking elixirs, and you'd likely get a fraudster with a silver tongue. Trust a general store's patent medicine shelf, and you'd find bottles with no labels or standards, as regulation was non-existent. Trust the local healer, and you might get a folk remedy, laudanum for pain, turpentine for worms, that did more harm than good. The lack of pharmaceutical oversight, as historian David Winks notes, meant medicines varied wildly in potency, often contaminated with impurities. In 1878, a Denver apothecary's records showed that 1 in 5 tonics tested contained lethal doses of toxins. Settlers like Sarah, seeking relief from a persistent cough, trusted Lydia's promises, only to find their symptoms masked by a drunken haze, their bodies slowly poisoned by the very cure they pinned their hopes on. Here's the shocker. These toxic medicines killed or maimed more people than many frontier diseases, turning desperate hope into a deadly trap. The Journal of the American Medical Association in 1879 estimated that patent medicines contributed to thousands of deaths annually, outstripping even tuberculosis in some regions. Lydia Pinkham, though celebrated as a pioneer for women's health, profited from a system that preyed on the vulnerable, her tonics leaving a trail of addiction and illness. Yet, settlers like Sarah persisted, swallowing bitter doses with a stubborn faith in survival. Her story, echoed in countless diaries from the Wyoming Historical Society, speaks of a resilience that defied betrayal as families clung to life despite medicines that mocked their trust. So, as you listen tonight, weighed down by modern worries, let Lydia's and Sarah's tale ground you. Your pharmacy has FDA labels, your doctors have degrees, luxuries they couldn't imagine. The settlers who trusted and survived these toxic brews didn't just endure. They forged a path toward a world where medicine heals more than it harms. Their struggle, waged against bottles of poison, whispers a truth. Your battles, daunting as they seem, unfold in a world far safer than theirs. While Lydia Pinkham's toxic tonics poisoned hope as often as they soothed it, the Wild West dealt settlers another brutal blow. The sheer ordeal of getting from one place to another, a journey that could break your body as easily as your spirit. Meet Sarah Raymond Herndon, a young schoolteacher who joined the Oregon Trail in 1871, her diary a vivid testament to the frontier's punishing travel. Sarah didn't hop into an air-conditioned SUV or catch a quick flight. She piled her family's meager belongings into a creaky wagon and faced a 2,000-mile trek across plains and mountains that seemed to mock human ambition. If you're stressed about a traffic jam or a delayed flight, picture Sarah, bouncing over ruts so deep they could swallow your patience, her bones rattled like dice in a gambler's cup. In the Wild West, travel wasn't an adventure. It was a gauntlet, where every mile tested your will to survive. Sarah's journey, chronicled in her 1902 book Days on the Road, paints a grueling picture of wagon travel. The Oregon Trail, a lifeline for westward migration, was no scenic highway. It was a dirt track carved by desperation, turning to mud in rain or dust in drought. Historical records from the National Park Service note that wagons, with no suspension beyond wooden wheels, jolted travelers until they were nauseous, a condition dubbed wagon sickness, akin to seasickness. Sarah's family endured, their wagon creaking under the weight of supplies, each bump a reminder that a broken axle could strand them miles from help. In 1871, as Oregon Trail logs show, 1 in 10 travelers died, some 40,000 souls, making it the nation's longest graveyard. If you're grumbling about a bumpy commute, imagine Sarah, clutching her children as the wagon lurched, praying it wouldn't tip into a river or snap in a storm. The dangers weren't just physical, they were relentless. Endure a day of jarring travel, and you'd face nights camping under stars that offered no comfort, with wolves howling or bandits lurking. Endure a river crossing and you risk drowning, as Sarah witnessed when a wagon capsized in the Platte River, sweeping away a family's dreams. Endure a dry stretch, and dust choked your lungs, as documented in trail diaries from 1873. The lack of reliable roads meant every journey was a gamble. Mud could trap wagons axle deep, while rocky paths shattered wheels. Sarah's diary recounts repairing a wagon with scavenged wood, her hands blistered from the effort. Historical data from the Oregon Historical Society estimates that 20% of wagons broke down, leaving families stranded with no mechanic or AAA to call. Travel didn't just test, it broke, leaving graves as mile markers across the prairie. Here's the shocker. The Oregon Trail alone claimed more lives than all the Wild West's infamous shootouts combined. The National Park Service's 1870s records report that disease, accidents, and exposure killed up to 15 people per mile of the 2,000-mile trail, a grave every 350 feet. Sarah Herndon, barely 24, saw children buried along the route, their parents pressing on with no time to grieve. Yet, she endured, guiding her family to Oregon with a resolve that shamed the trail's cruelty. Her story, etched in her diary, speaks of settlers who pushed through mud, dust, and despair, their determination a quiet defiance of a land that seemed to want them dead. So, as you listen tonight, frazzled by the chaos of your day, let Sarah's tale ground you. Your world has highways, GPS, and roadside diners, luxuries she could only dream of. The settlers who endured those brutal journeys didn't just survive. They carved paths to a future we walk today. Their struggle, waged against ruts and rivers, whispers a truth. Your battles, exhausting as they feel, unfold in a world far kinder than theirs. As Sarah Raymond Herndon endured the bone-rattling ordeal of the Oregon Trail, dodging ruts and rivers with a schoolteacher's resolve, the Wild West imposed a subtler but no less crushing burden, a suffocating isolation that cut settlers off from the world like a ship adrift in a starless sea. Meet Ellen Nellie Cashman, a miner and boarding house keeper in Arizona's Tombstone during the 1870s, whose letters reveal a life tethered to a frontier where news arrived slower than a three-legged mule. Nellie, known as the Angel of Tombstone for her charity, waited months for a letter from family back east, each delayed scrap of paper a lifeline to a world she might never see again. If you're stressed about an unanswered email or a spotty Wi-Fi signal, picture Nellie, staring at an empty horizon, her heart sinking with every mail wagon that passed her by. In the Wild West, information wasn't just scarce, it was a ghost, leaving settlers to languish in a void of silence. Nellie's story, preserved in the Arizona Historical Society's archives, underscores the frontier's communication blackout. Mail delivery, as historian Patricia Limerick notes, was a gamble. Letters took weeks or months if they arrived at all, often lost to floods, bandits, or careless drivers. In 1878, Tombstone's post office records show that half the mail from the East Coast never reached its destination, leaving families like Nellie's in the dark. Newspapers, when they trickled in, were weeks old, their headlines as stale as last month's biscuits. Settlers yearned for news of loved ones or world events, but the frontier mocked their longing. Nellie wrote of going a year without word from her sister, unsure if she was alive or dead. If you're frustrated by a slow text reply, imagine the ache of waiting months for a letter that might never come. Your only company, the howl of the wind. This isolation didn't just starve the heart, it broke the mind. Wait for a letter and you'd wrestle with hope that curdled into dread. Wait for news, and you'd face rumors warped by retelling, as when Nellie heard false tales of a smallpox outbreak back east. Wait for connection, and you'd risk sinking into despair, a condition so common it birthed the term prairie madness. Historical diaries from the Wyoming Historical Society describe settlers abandoning homesteads, driven to breaking points by silence. In 1879, a Kansas settlement reported a woman who took her life after months without word from her family, her story one of many. The frontier's isolation wasn't just physical, it was a psychological cage, locking minds in loneliness. Your modern stresses, unread messages, missed calls, pale against a world where silence could stretch for years, leaving you to wonder if you'd been forgotten. Here's the shocker. This crushing isolation drove more settlers to despair or death than many of the Wild West's physical dangers. The National Archives' 1870s records estimate that depression and suicide, often linked to loneliness, claimed hundreds annually, rivaling the toll of disease or accidents. Nellie Cashman, who ran a boarding house to keep miners fed and spirits high, fought this darkness by fostering community, sharing what little news she gleaned. Her letters recount nights spent reading old newspapers aloud to boarders, each word a small rebellion against the void. Yet, even she admitted to moments of despair, her faith tested by the silence of a world beyond the desert. So, as you listen tonight, frazzled by the noise of modern life, let Nellie's tale ground you. Your world has instant texts, video calls, and news at your fingertips, luxuries she could only dream of. The settlers who waited and survived in that silent frontier didn't just endure. They built connections despite the odds, their resilience a beacon in the darkness. Their struggle, waged against a tide of isolation, whispers a truth. Your battles, lonely as they feel, unfold in a world far more connected than theirs. As Ellen Nellie Cashman battled the aching silence of a frontier cut off from letters and news, the Wild West wove a darker trap for the mind, one that could unravel even the toughest souls like a frayed rope under too much strain. Meet Sarah Good, a Nebraska homesteader in the 1870s whose diary, preserved in the Nebraska State Historical Society, chronicles a descent into what settlers called prairie madness, a mental collapse born of relentless isolation. Sarah, a mother of 3, lived miles from her nearest neighbor, her days filled with endless chores and nights haunted by a quiet so profound it seemed to whisper despair. If you're stressed about unanswered texts or a buzzing inbox, picture Sarah, staring out at an endless sea of grass, her only company the wind's mocking howl. In the Wild West, loneliness didn't just weigh on you, it broke you, turning solitude into a silent predator. Sarah's life, detailed in her 1878 diary, was a testament to the frontier's psychological toll. With no phones, no internet, and neighbors too far to visit without a day's trek, settlers like her lived in a bubble of isolation. Historical records from the University of Nebraska show that homesteaders often went weeks without speaking to anyone outside their family, their world shrinking to the walls of a sod house. Sarah wrote of days when she longed for a voice, any voice, to break the monotony, but the prairie offered only silence. This wasn't just boredom, it was a slow erosion of sanity. Women, especially, bore the brunt, as men often left for supplies or work, leaving them alone with children and chores. If you're frazzled by a chaotic workday, imagine Sarah, counting the days since she last heard a human voice, her mind teetering on the edge of despair. The madness wasn't just a figure of speech, it was a documented crisis. Break under the weight of silence and you might sink into depression, as Sarah did, her diary confessing nights spent weeping for no reason she could name. Break under the strain of endless solitude, and you might turn violent, as some settlers did, lashing out at family in fits of rage. Break completely, and you might end your life, as historical accounts from 1879 Nebraska report, with suicides among homesteaders alarmingly common. The term prairie madness, coined by frontier doctors, described a range of symptoms: depression, anxiety, even psychosis, triggered by isolation and relentless work. Sarah's entries speak of hallucinations, seeing figures in the grass that weren't there, a sign her mind was cracking under the frontier's weight. Your modern stresses, deadlines, social overload fade when you consider a world where silence could drive you to the brink. Here's the shocker. Prairie madness claimed lives as surely as cholera or blizzards, with isolation proving deadlier than many physical threats. The National Archives' 1870s records estimate that hundreds of settlers succumbed to mental breakdowns or suicide annually, their deaths often unrecorded in unmarked graves. Sarah Good, though battered by despair, held on, her diary a lifeline where she poured out her fears, finding solace in writing what she couldn't say aloud. Her resilience, shared by countless women who fought the prairie's silence, was a quiet rebellion against a world that seemed to want them broken. So, as you listen tonight, worn thin by the clamor of your day, let Sarah's story ground you. Your world has group chats, coffee dates, and therapists, luxuries she could only dream of. The settlers who broke and survived the frontier's loneliness didn't just endure, they carved out lives in a void that tested their souls. Their struggle, waged against a tide of silence, whispers a truth. Your battles, heavy as they feel, unfold in a world far more connected and kinder than theirs. As Sarah Good's battle with prairie madness laid bare the Wild West's crushing loneliness, the frontier revealed another layer of its complex heart, a vibrant tapestry of cultures stitched together by hardship, yet frayed by prejudice. Meet Wong Kim Ark, a Chinese immigrant who worked as a cook and merchant in San Francisco's bustling Chinatown during the 1870s, his life a testament to the diversity and discrimination that defined the West. Wong didn't just navigate dusty streets or silent prairies. He moved through a world where his very presence sparked resentment, despite his tireless labor. If you're stressed about office politics or a snide coworker, picture Wong serving meals to miners who spat slurs as freely as they spat tobacco. In the Wild West, diversity wasn't a buzzword. It was a reality, a melting pot of people boiling over with tension and tenacity. Wong's story, documented in California's historical records, reflects a frontier teeming with varied faces. Chinese laborers like Wong built railroads and mined gold, their sweat laying tracks across the Sierras. Mexicans, long settled in the Southwest before it became American, ranched and farmed with skills honed over generations. Black cowboys, making up a quarter of some ranch crews, drove cattle through Texas dust, as noted in historian Kenneth Porter's work. European immigrants, Germans, Irish, Scandinavians, brought their traditions, while Native American tribes fought to preserve theirs. The 1870 U.S. Census records show that nearly a third of the West's population was non-white or foreign-born, a mosaic of cultures far richer than Hollywood's cowboy cliches. Yet Wong faced jeers, and worse, his contributions ignored in a land that promised opportunity but delivered scorn. If you're fuming about workplace bias, imagine cooking for men who'd burn your home for a paycheck. This diversity didn't breed harmony, it fueled conflict. Clash with a white miner over a claim, and you'd face violence, as Wong did when anti-Chinese riots swept San Francisco in 1877, documented in local newspapers. Clash with land laws favoring Anglo settlers, and Mexicans lost ancestral ranches to legal trickery, as seen in New Mexico court records. Clash with social norms, and black cowboys were barred from saloons that their white peers frequented. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, born from frontier prejudice, banned Chinese immigration, targeting men like Wong despite their backbreaking work. Historical accounts from the Bancroft Library note that Chinese workers were paid half what whites earned for the same dangerous jobs, like blasting tunnels through mountains. Wong, who later fought for his citizenship in a landmark 1898 Supreme Court case, endured, his resilience a quiet defiance of a system stacked against him. Here's the shocker. The Wild West's diversity, its greatest strength, was also its cruelest battleground, with prejudice killing dreams as surely as disease or bullets. The California State Archives reports that anti-Chinese violence alone claimed hundreds of lives in the 1870s, while Mexican landowners lost millions of acres to fraudulent claims post-Mexican-American War. Wong Kim Ark, serving meals and running a small shop, faced mobs and laws that branded him an outsider, yet he persisted, his legal battle shaping America's citizenship laws. His story, like those of countless others, speaks of a frontier where cultures collided, sometimes creating vibrant communities, sometimes sparking brutal exclusion. So, as you listen tonight, weighed down by modern stresses, let Wong's tale ground you. Your world has diversity training, legal protections, and a global community, luxuries he could only dream of. The settlers who clashed and survived in that diverse West didn't just endure. They wove a complex nation from their struggles. Their fight, waged against a tide of prejudice, whispers a truth. Your battles, divisive as they feel, unfold in a world far fairer than theirs. While Wong Kim Ark's resilience in the face of prejudice painted a vivid picture of the Wild West's diverse yet divided communities, no group bore the frontier's brutality more cruelly than its Native American tribes, whose world was shattered like glass under a settler's boot. Meet Sitting Bull, the Lakota leader who fought to preserve his people's way of life in the 1870s, his defiance etched in the annals of Montana's plains. Sitting Bull didn't just face encroaching settlers. He confronted a deliberate campaign to erase his culture, from the slaughter of buffalo to the theft of sacred lands. If you're stressed about a corporate restructuring or a lost promotion, picture Sitting Bull, watching his people's lifeline, the buffalo, gunned down by the thousands, their survival gutted by greed. In the Wild West, Native Americans didn't just struggle, they suffered an apocalypse, their heritage crushed under the weight of a nation's expansion. Sitting Bull's story, recorded in oral histories and U.S. Army reports from the Montana Historical Society, reveals a frontier where Native tribes faced systematic destruction. The American bison, once numbering 30 to 60 million, was hunted to near extinction by 1884, with fewer than 1,000 remaining, as documented by the Smithsonian Institution. This wasn't just sport, it was policy, encouraged by figures like General Philip Sheridan to starve Plains tribes into submission. Sitting Bull, leading the Lakota, saw his people's food source vanish, their hunting grounds carved up by settlers and railroads. The 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn, where his forces defeated Custer's cavalry, was a fleeting victory, followed by relentless military campaigns that burned villages and killed women and children, as noted in federal records. If you're fuming about a workplace injustice, imagine losing your entire way of life to broken treaties and deliberate devastation. The suffering wasn't just physical, it was cultural genocide. Lose your land and you'd be herded onto reservations with barren soil, as the Lakota were after 1877 per the Bureau of Indian Affairs archives. Lose your children, and they'd be sent to boarding schools like Carlisle, where, as Captain Richard Pratt infamously said, the goal was to kill the Indian, save the man. Lose your identity, and your language, religion, and traditions were outlawed, replaced with forced assimilation. By 1900, the native population had plummeted from millions to under 300,000, ravaged by disease, warfare, and displacement, according to census data. Sitting Bull, who resisted until he died in 1890, saw his people stripped of their heritage, their children torn from families to erase their culture. Your modern stresses, office politics, tight deadlines, pale against a world where survival meant surrendering everything that made you who you are. Here's the shocker. The destruction of Native American tribes wasn't a byproduct of the Wild West. It was a deliberate strategy, more devastating than any outlaw raid or frontier disease. The U.S. government's policies, as historian D. Brown details in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, aimed to break tribes like the Lakota by annihilating their resources and culture with buffalo hunts and reservation systems as weapons. Sitting Bull, a spiritual and military leader, fought to preserve his people's way of life, his resistance a beacon of defiance against overwhelming odds. Yet even he couldn't stop the tide of loss, his final years spent under surveillance on a reservation. So, as you listen tonight, weighed down by the pressures of your day, let Sitting Bull's story ground you. Your world has cultural protections, diversity laws, and global connections, luxuries his people could only dream of. The Native Americans who suffered and survived this apocalypse didn't just endure. They carried their heritage forward despite unimaginable loss. Their struggle, waged against a tide of erasure, whispers a truth. Your battles, heavy as they feel, unfold in a world far kinder than theirs. While Sitting Bull's Lakota faced the frontier's brutal erasure of their culture, another group fought a quieter but no less fierce battle against the Wild West's harsh odds. Women whose strength was as unyielding as the prairie itself, yet shackled by a society that dismissed their worth. Meet Esther Morris, a Wyoming homesteader and justice of the peace in the 1870s, whose story shines a light on the relentless grit of frontier women. Esther didn't just manage a household. She plowed fields, birthed children, and broke barriers as one of the first female judges in America, all while navigating a world that saw her as little more than a man's shadow. If you're stressed about juggling work and life, picture Esther rising before dawn to churn butter, mend fences, and deliver justice in a town where women's voices were barely a whisper. In the Wild West, women didn't just survive, they thrived, defying a system that tried to chain them to the kitchen. Esther's life, documented in the Wyoming State Archives, was a testament to the backbreaking labor women endured. Historical records show that frontier women worked alongside men, planting crops, herding cattle, and defending homes from predators, both animal and human. Esther, who settled in South Pass City, hauled water, chopped wood, and sewed clothes by candlelight, her days stretching from before sunrise to well past dusk. Unlike the helpless damsels of Hollywood westerns, women like her were the backbone of homesteads, often outlasting their husbands, who fell to disease or violence. In 1870, Wyoming led the nation by granting women the vote, a nod to their indispensable role, as historian T.A. Larson notes. Yet, Esther faced scorn from men who scoffed at her judicial role, her gavel a symbol of defiance in a world that denied women legal rights. If you're frazzled by a glass ceiling, imagine wielding authority in a town where your vote was a radical act. The struggle wasn't just physical, it was societal. Toil in the fields, and you'd still face laws that barred married women from owning property, as seen in territorial statutes. Toil as a widow, and you'd raise children alone, like many who lost husbands to mining accidents or saloon fights. Toil as an unmarried woman, and you'd be limited to teaching or seamstressing, with pay half that of men per 1870s labor records. Domestic violence, considered a private matter, left women with no legal recourse, as Esther witnessed in her courtroom, where she advocated for the abused despite pushback. Her diaries recount cases of women beaten by husbands, their pleas ignored by a system that valued male authority over justice. Your modern stresses, work-life balance, office politics, pale against a world where a woman's labor was endless, her rights nearly non-existent, yet her resilience unshakable. Here's the shocker. Women in the Wild West, despite their monumental contributions, were often erased from history, their stories buried under myths of cowboys and outlaws. The U.S. Census of 1870 shows women made up nearly a third of the frontier workforce, running farms, boarding houses, and even saloons, yet their names rarely graced history books. Esther Morris, who helped secure Wyoming's landmark suffrage law, stood as a beacon, her courtroom a stage for justice in a land that offered little. Her persistence, like that of countless women who toiled through hardship, was a quiet revolution, reshaping a nation that undervalued them. So, as you listen tonight, worn thin by the demands of your day, let Esther's story ground you. Your world has equal pay laws, voting rights, and protections. Luxuries she could only dream of. The women who toiled and thrived in that unforgiving frontier didn't just survive. They carved a path for equality we walk today. Their struggle, waged against a tide of bias, whispers a truth. Your battles, daunting as they feel, unfold in a world far fairer than theirs. As Esther Morris wielded her gavel to carve out justice for women in Wyoming's rugged frontier, another group faced a different kind of crucible in the Wild West. Miners whose dreams of gold were ground to dust by a job as deadly as a rattlesnake's bite. Meet John Sutter, the California pioneer whose 1848 gold strike sparked the gold rush, only to see thousands perish in the mines that followed. Sutter, once a dreamer of wealth, watched men like himself descend into dark, unstable shafts, chasing flecks of gold that promised riches but delivered death. If you're stressed about a grueling workday or a tight budget, picture Sutter, navigating a mining camp where every swing of a pickaxe was a gamble with collapse or poison. In the Wild West, mining wasn't just work, it was a dance with disaster, where the earth itself seemed to conspire against you. Sutter's story, preserved in the California State Library's archives, reveals the brutal reality of frontier mining. By the 1870s, the easy gold of the early rush was gone, leaving miners to toil in deep, hard rock mines. Historical records from the U.S. Geological Survey describe shafts prone to cave-ins, where loose rock could crush a man in seconds. Sutter saw workers choke on toxic gases like carbon monoxide, odorless but lethal, with no ventilation to clear the air. Blasting with black powder or dynamite, as miners did in Nevada's Comstock lode, was a daily roulette. Misfires blew off limbs or sent shrapnel flying. In 1876, a Virginia City mine explosion, reported in local newspapers, killed 20 men in an instant, their bodies buried under tons of earth. If you're grumbling about a tough performance review, imagine Sutter, watching comrades vanish in a flash of fire, knowing the next blast could be his last. The danger wasn't just immediate, it was insidious. Dig through rock, and you'd inhale silica dust, seeding your lungs with silicosis, a disease that suffocated miners over the years, as medical logs from Colorado's 1877 camps confirm. Dig for gold, and you'd handle mercury, used to process ore, which caused tremors and madness, as seen in Sutter's own declining health. Dig for survival, and you'd earn pennies for 12-hour days, as most miners worked for companies that reaped the profits. The 1870s saw large corporations dominate mining, leaving independent prospectors like Sutter broke, as historian Mark Twain noted in his writings. Safety regulations? Non-existent. A broken leg meant the end of your career, with no disability pay to cushion the fall. Your modern stresses, overtime, micromanaging bosses, pale against a world where every shift could bury you alive. Here's the shocker. Mining in the Wild West killed more men than all the frontier's gunfights and outlaw raids combined. The Bureau of Mines' early records estimate that thousands died annually in the 1870s from cave-ins, explosions, and lung disease, dwarfing the tally of Hollywood's dramatic shootouts. Sutter, who lost his fortune to the very rush he sparked, saw miners perish in droves, their dreams of wealth crushed under rock or poisoned by mercury. Yet, he persisted, working alongside them, his stubborn hope a flicker in the darkness of those deadly shafts. His story, like those of countless miners, speaks of a frontier where labor was a gauntlet. Yet men dug on, driven by a hunger for a better life. So as you listen tonight, worn out by the grind of your day, let Sutter's tale ground you. Your world has unions, safety laws, and desk jobs, luxuries he could only dream of. The miners who dug and died in those unforgiving depths didn't just survive. They fueled a nation's growth with their sacrifice. Their struggle, waged against a tide of rock and ruin, whispers a truth. Your battles, exhausting as they feel, unfold in a world far safer than theirs. While John Sutter's miners faced the deadly depths of the Wild West's gold shafts, another group toiled under the open sky, wrestling with a land as unforgiving as a debt collector's scowl. Farmers, whose dreams of fertile fields were crushed by the frontier's relentless cruelty. Meet Charles Ingalls, the homesteader immortalized in his daughter Laura's little house on the prairie, who battled Kansas soil in the 1870s to carve a life from the dirt. Charles didn't just farm. He waged war against a prairie so stubborn it seemed to mock every swing of his plow. If you're stressed about a looming project deadline or a tight budget, picture Charles, his hands blistered and back bent, fighting a land that offered more heartbreak than harvest. In the Wild West, farming wasn't just labor. It was a brutal test, where every seed planted was a gamble against nature's wrath. Charles's struggle, detailed in Laura Ingalls Wilder's memoirs, reflects the grueling reality of frontier agriculture. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres to anyone who could improve the land. But as historian Joanna Stratton notes, the arid plains defied eastern farming methods. Charles, like many, built a sod house, dark, damp, and crawling with snakes, because timber was scarcer than a kind word in a saloon. Breaking the prairie's dense sod, matted with centuries-old grass roots, took months of back-breaking work with crude plows, as documented in Kansas land records. A single day's labor could leave a farmer's body broken, his hands bloodied from the plow's rough handles. In 1874, a swarm of locusts descended on Kansas, devouring Charles's crops in hours, as reported in local gazettes. If you're grumbling about a bad quarter at work, imagine watching your year's labor vanish in a cloud of insects, your family's survival hanging by a thread. The hardship wasn't just physical, it was a relentless assault on hope. Sow your seeds and drought could wither them before they sprouted, as happened in Nebraska in 1876 per agricultural reports. Sow again, and torrential rains might wash your fields away, leaving mud where dreams once grew. Sow through illness, and you'd risk collapse as Charles did, plowing while feverish because stopping meant starvation. The isolation of homesteads, miles from neighbors, amplified the strain, with no hired help to ease the burden. Historical diaries from the National Archives reveal that women like Charles's wife, Caroline, often worked the fields pregnant or days after childbirth, their health sacrificed to the land's demands. Your modern stresses, overtime, endless emails, pale against a world where a single frost could doom your family to hunger. Here's the shocker. Farming in the Wild West was so deadly that it rivaled mining in its toll, with accidents and exhaustion claiming lives as surely as cave-ins. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's 1870s records estimate that thousands of homesteaders died annually from farm accidents, crushed by plows, trampled by livestock, or suffocated in grain bins. Charles Ingalls, who persevered through locusts and blizzards, saw neighbors abandon their claims, broken by the land's refusal to yield. Yet, he sowed on, his family's survival a testament to a grit that defied the odds. His story, woven into Laura's books, speaks of farmers who fought nature's fury, their sweat and tears watering a nation's roots. So, as you listen tonight, worn out by the pressures of your day, let Charles's tale ground you. Your world has tractors, grocery stores, and safety nets, luxuries he could only dream of. The farmers who sowed and survived in that unforgiving frontier didn't just endure. They built a future we reap today. Their struggle, waged against a tide of drought and despair, whispers a truth. Your battles, grueling as they feel, unfold in a world far kinder than theirs. As Charles Ingalls battled the prairie's stubborn soil, sowing seeds against a tide of locusts and drought, another group of Wild West dreamers faced a different beast. Ranchers, whose lives were tethered to cattle as unpredictable as a saloon poker game. Meet Nat Love, a black cowboy whose 1870s adventures across the Texas plains, chronicled in his 1907 autobiography, Life and Adventures of Nat Love, reveal the high-stakes gamble of ranching. Nat didn't just herd cattle. He wrestled with a landscape and livestock that could crush a man's hopes faster than a corporate layoff. If you're stressed about a volatile stock market or a tough performance review, picture Nat driving 1,000 head of cattle through dust and storms, knowing one wrong move could spell ruin. In the Wild West, ranching wasn't a romantic ride into the sunset. It was a brutal dance with danger, where survival hung on the horns of a stampeding herd. Nat's story, preserved in the Texas State Historical Association's archives, lays bare the relentless risks of frontier ranching. Cattle drives, like those Nat joined on the Chisholm Trail, stretched hundreds of miles, moving herds to railheads for eastern markets. Historical records from the 1870s show that cowboys worked 20-hour days, catching naps in the saddle, their bodies battered by heat, cold, and relentless dust. A single lightning strike or a coyote's howl could spark a stampede, turning 1,500-pound beasts into a thundering wave that trampled anything in its path. In 1876, a stampede near Abilene, reported in local newspapers, killed 3 cowboys, their bodies mangled beyond recognition. Nat, a skilled rider, survived such chaos, but his autobiography recounts close calls with panicked herds. If you're grumbling about a long commute, imagine riding through a dust storm, your life at the mercy of cattle with minds of their own. The risks didn't end with stampedes, they multiplied. Face a river crossing and you'd risk drowning, as Nat did when fording the Red River, where swift currents swept away men and livestock, as documented in trail logs. Face a harsh winter and entire herds could freeze, like the Great Die-Up of 1886-87, which killed 90% of cattle on northern ranges, per the National Cattlemen's Association. Face disease, Texas fever, or anthrax could wipe out your investment, with no vaccines to stem the loss. Ranchers like Nat, often working for wages as low as $30 a month, as historian D. Brown notes, had little to fall back on. Black and Mexican cowboys, who made up a significant portion of the workforce, faced extra scorn, barred from saloons or equal pay despite their skill. Your modern stresses, budget cuts, office politics, pale against a world where one bad season could bankrupt you or cost your life. Here's the shocker. Ranching in the Wild West was so deadly that it rivaled mining and farming in its body count, with nature and livestock claiming more lives than any outlaw's gun. The Bureau of Land Management's 1870s records estimate that thousands of cowboys died annually from stampedes, drownings, or exposure, their graves unmarked along dusty trails. Nat Love, one of the few black cowboys to pen his story, survived countless drives, his quick reflexes a shield against the frontier's wrath. His tale, rich with tales of roping steers under starlit skies, speaks of a grit that defied the odds, turning transient cowhands into legends. So, as you listen tonight, worn thin by the chaos of your day, let Nat's story ground you. Your world has stable jobs, weather apps, and safety nets, luxuries he could only dream of. The cowboys who faced and survived those perilous drives didn't just endure, they forged a nation's cattle industry with their sweat and blood. Their struggle, waged against a tide of hooves and hazards, whispers a truth. Your battles, grueling as they feel, unfold in a world far safer than theirs. As Nat Love roped steers through the Wild West's perilous trails, dodging stampedes with a cowboy's grit, a new force was reshaping the frontier's untamed heart. The iron roar of railroads and the greedy grip of corporate giants, swallowing dreams as swiftly as a prairie fire. Meet Leland Stanford, a railroad tycoon and founder of the Central Pacific Railroad, whose tracks in the 1870s stitched the east to the west, transforming dusty outposts into bustling hubs. Stanford didn't just lay rails, he wielded power, his company squeezing small farmers and miners like a banker foreclosing on a desperate debtor. If you're stressed about a corporate merger or a cutthroat workplace, picture a homesteader facing Stanford's empire, where a single freight rate could bankrupt a family's hopes. In the Wild West, railroads didn't just connect, they conquered, paving the way for a modern America while crushing the little guy under their wheels. Stanford's Central Pacific, completed in 1869 at Promontory Summit, as chronicled in the Utah Historical Society's records, slashed travel time from months to days, flooding the West with goods and settlers. But this revolution came at a cost. Historical accounts from the National Archives show that railroad companies, backed by government land grants, controlled vast swaths of territory, dictating prices that strangled independent producers. Farmers like those Nat Love supplied with cattle paid exorbitant rates to ship their goods, as Stanford's monopoly set fees that favored big businesses. In 1878, Kansas farmers' petitions, preserved in state archives, decried rates so high they devoured profits, leaving families destitute. Miners, too, watched their claims gobbled up by corporate outfits with better equipment, as Stanford's wealth funded industrial mining. If you're fuming about a corporate policy stifling your work, imagine losing your livelihood to a railroad baron's whim, your sweat worth nothing against their ledger. The conquest wasn't just economic, it was cultural. Dominate the land, and railroads redrew the West's map, turning transient camps into permanent towns, as historian Richard White notes. Dominate the markets, and small ranchers like Nat's employers couldn't compete with cattle conglomerates backed by Stanford's rail lines. Dominate the politics, and companies lobbied for laws that favored their interests, from water rights to mineral claims, leaving homesteaders scrambling. In 1875, California's land records show that corporate lobbying stripped thousands of acres from small farmers through legal loopholes. Stanford, a former governor, wielded influence that shaped territorial governments, ensuring his empire thrived while others withered. Your modern stresses, office hierarchies, unfair promotions, pale against a world where a tycoon's handshake could rewrite your future, leaving you landless in a land of promise. Here's the shocker. The railroads, hailed as the Wild West's triumph, destroyed more dreams than they built, with corporate greed claiming livelihoods as ruthlessly as any outlaw. The congressional record of the 1870s estimates that railroad monopolies bankrupted tens of thousands of small farmers and ranchers, their lands seized or rendered worthless by predatory pricing. Stanford, who amassed a fortune while workers like Chinese laborers died blasting his tunnels, symbolized a shift from rugged individualism to corporate dominance. Yet men like Nat Love persisted, driving cattle to railheads despite the odds, their labor fueling an economy that often spat in their faces. Their stories, woven into the West's fabric, speak of a resilience that defied the iron grip of progress. So, as you listen tonight, worn out by the grind of your day, let Stanford's tale ground you. Your world has labor laws, unions, and fair trade, luxuries those homesteaders could only dream of. The settlers who dominated and survived this corporate tide didn't just endure, they laid tracks for a nation we inhabit today. Their struggle, waged against a tide of greed and steel, whispers a truth. Your battles, cutthroat as they feel, unfold in a world far fairer than theirs. As Leland Stanford's railroads steamrolled the Wild West into a new era of corporate dominance, crushing small dreamers under their iron wheels, another force was quietly reshaping the frontier's legacy, the glittering myths of Hollywood, painting a gritty reality with a glossy brush. Meet Buffalo Bill Cody, the showman whose Wild West shows in the 1880s turned the raw struggle of the frontier into a spectacle of heroic cowboys and villainous outlaws. Cody didn't just perform, he crafted a legend, staging shootouts and stagecoach chases that bore little resemblance to the West he'd lived in. If you're stressed about a manipulative boss or a skewed performance review, picture Cody, selling a sanitized version of a world where survival is more about grit than glory. In the Wild West, the truth wasn't just bent, it was buried, replaced by a myth that turned hardship into entertainment for Eastern audiences. Cody's Wild West shows, as documented in the Nebraska State Historical Society, drew thousands with reenactments of Indian battles and outlaw raids, but they were as staged as a corporate PR campaign. Historical records from the 1880s show that real frontier violence was messy, drunken saloon brawls or ambushes, not the high noon duels Cody dramatized. His shows, launched in 1883, featured sharpshooters like Annie Oakley, but ignored the disease, labor, and prejudice that defined the West. Dime novels, churned out by Eastern publishers like Beadle and Adams, further spun tales of heroic gunslingers, often written by authors who'd never set foot past the Mississippi. These stories, as historian Richard Etelaine notes, painted a West of clear heroes and villains, erasing the complex lives of miners, farmers, and native tribes. If you're fuming about a misleading company narrative, imagine a world where your entire existence was rewritten as a cowboy fantasy. The myth-making wasn't just entertainment, it distorted history's truth. Obscure the toil of women like Esther Morris, and Hollywood replaced them with damsels in distress. Obscure the suffering of Native Americans like Sitting Bull, and films cast them as savage foes, ignoring their cultural devastation. Obscure the labor of black cowboys like Nat Love, and the West became a white man's tale, sidelining a quarter of its workforce, as census data from 1870 reveals. Cody's shows, while celebrating frontier spirit, fueled a narrative that justified expansion as civilizing a wilderness, glossing over the genocide and corporate greed that built it. By the 1890s, as the frontier closed, these myths filled a cultural void, offering Americans a simplified story of triumph, as historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued. Your modern stresses, corporate spin, skewed media, pale against a world where history itself was rewritten to sell tickets. Here's the shocker. The Hollywood myth of the Wild West, born in Cody's shows and dime novels, buried the real frontier's pain so thoroughly that it shaped America's identity more than the truth ever did. The Library of Congress's 1880s archives estimate that Cody's shows reached millions, embedding a romanticized West in the national psyche, while the struggles of diverse settlers faded into obscurity. Buffalo Bill, a former scout-turned-showman, profited by turning his gritty past into a spectacle, but even he admitted in private letters that the real West was far harsher than his staged heroics. Yet he persisted, his performances a defiant act of storytelling that gave meaning to a vanishing era. So, as you listen tonight, worn out by the distortions of your day, let Cody's tale ground you. Your world has fact-checkers, documentaries, and open archives, luxuries his audiences could only dream of. The settlers whose lives were obscured by myth didn't just survive. They laid the foundation for a nation we question today. Their struggle, waged against a tide of erasure, whispers a truth. Your battles, twisted as they feel, unfold in a world far truer than theirs. While Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows spun a dazzling myth that buried the frontier's gritty truths under a sheen of cowboy heroics, the real legacy of the Wild West endures in a tangle of triumph and tragedy, as intricate as a prairie wind weaving through time. Meet Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian whose 1893 essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, argued that the West shaped America's soul, a claim rooted in the lives of settlers like Nat Love, Esther Morris, and Sitting Bull. Turner didn't just study the frontier, he wrestled with its contradictions, seeing a nation forged by courage, yet scarred by injustice. If you're stressed about navigating corporate red tape or societal divides, picture Turner, sifting through stories of a West that built America's identity while leaving wounds that still bleed. In the Wild West, the legacy wasn't just progress, it was a paradox, a foundation laid with both dreams and devastation. Turner's thesis, preserved in the Library of Congress, credits the frontier with fostering American individualism, democracy, and resilience. The Homestead Act of 1862, which Charles Ingalls used to claim his Kansas plot, birthed property laws that still underpin land ownership, as legal historian John Witt notes. Water rights, shaped by Mexican systems before Anglo settlers rewrote them, remain a cornerstone of Western states' governance, per 1870s territorial records. The diversity of Wong Kim Ark's San Francisco, despite its prejudices, sowed seeds for America's multicultural fabric. Yet, Turner acknowledged the darker side, the near annihilation of native tribes like Sitting Bull's Lakota, whose population plummeted from millions to under 300,000 by 1900, according to U.S. Census data. If you're fuming about a workplace injustice, imagine the treaties broken to seize tribal lands, a betrayal that fueled a century of struggle for native sovereignty. The paradox wasn't just cultural, it was structural. Shape a nation with rugged individualism, and you'd foster a spirit of self-reliance, as seen in Nat Love's cattle drives. Shape it with community cooperation, and you'd see barn raisings and harvest teams, as Esther Morris's Wyoming neighbors practiced. Shape it with corporate greed, and Leland Stanford's railroads tilted the scales toward wealth over fairness. The 1870s saw these tensions crystallize, with federal policies favoring big business while small farmers faced ruin, as documented in congressional reports. Turner's work highlights how these clashes, individual versus collective, progress versus preservation, still echo in American debates over land use and governance. Your modern stresses, balancing personal goals with team demands, pale against a world where every choice shaped a nation's future, often at the cost of entire peoples. Here's the shocker. The Wild West legacy isn't a tidy tale of triumph, but a messy collision of courage and cruelty that defines America more than any Hollywood script. The National Archives' 1890s records show that the frontier's closing sparked a crisis of identity, as Americans grappled with the loss of a mythologized West while ignoring its real costs: genocide, environmental ruin, and systemic inequity. Turner, lecturing in Chicago as the frontier faded, saw settlers like Sarah Good and Wong Kim Ark build a nation through sheer will, yet their stories were overshadowed by Cody's spectacles. His essay, A Touchstone for Historians, argues that the West's struggles forged a democracy that thrives today, but at a price we're still paying. So, as you listen tonight, worn out by the chaos of your day, let Turner's tale ground you. Your world has laws, diversity, and debates born from that frontier, luxuries those settlers could only dream of. The men and women who shaped and survived the Wild West didn't just endure. They crafted a nation from their triumphs and tragedies. Their struggle, waged against a tide of paradox, whispers a truth. Your battles, complex as they feel, unfold in a world far richer than theirs. As the Wild West fades into the starlit hush, its legacy lingers like embers in a dying fire, a testament to human grit forged in a crucible of hardship. From Sarah Good's lonely prairie to Nat Love's thundering cattle drives, the frontier wasn't just a place. It was a proving ground, where every day survived was a victory against a world that offered no mercy. These settlers, battling filth, disease, and prejudice, didn't just endure, they shaped a nation, their struggles paving the roads we walk today. Your stresses, deadlines, disputes, seem lighter now, don't they, in a world with clean water and Wi-Fi? So, as you unwind tonight, let their resilience inspire you. Drop a comment below with where you're tuning in from or how this tale hit you. Share it with friends who'd love this gritty history. The fire crackles on, but the West's truth burns brighter, whispering courage across time.